Welcome to the Garden Talk podcast, where we interview growers from all over the world, both beginners and experts, seeking to learn more about what they know about gardening and how they do things in their garden. What's up, everybody? For those of you that don't know me, my name is Chris, aka Mr. Grow It, and you're tuned into the Garden Talk podcast. This is episode number 177. In this episode, I interview Paul, also known as Clone Coach. He was on the podcast once before, episode 60, back in 2022, where we talked all about cloning. Today, we'll continue the conversation with a deeper dive into cloning, talking about topics such as nutrition for clones, aeroponic cloning, environment conditions. We'll get into some viewer-submitted questions, and much more. If you want to see short clips of these podcast episodes, search Garden Talk Clips on YouTube. I also have a gardening channel where I show the plants that I grow. Both of those channels will be linked down in the YouTube description section below. One of my goals for this podcast is to bring free information about gardening to the general public. That being said, I'd like to thank the sponsors of today's episode who helped make that goal possible. Thanks to Humidity for sponsoring this episode. Check out their electric sprayers with a 2-liter capacity and an adjustable nozzle that can go from a strong jet to a fine mist spray. Their sprayers are battery powered and can be used for 3 hours on a full charge. No pumping required, and it's a one-button operation. Click the link in the description section below so you can learn more about their sprayers, and the discount code MrGrowIt15 works on both Amazon and their website, acinfinity.com. Stash Blend. Several additives in one blend, so you no longer have to buy individual bottles. Check it out at stashblend.com, link in the description section below, and use the discount code THESTASH. And we are back, and I'm joined with Clone Coach Paul. How you doing today?
What's going on, Chris, aka Mr. Grow It?
Good to have you back on the podcast. You were on here once before, a long time ago. Man, time has been flying. The last time you were on here was 2022, 3 years ago. That episode has 165,000 views. It's definitely a fan favorite. So many people have commented on that video over the years and really just thanked you for the amount of knowledge that you've given in that episode. So thanks for doing that episode, and thanks for coming back on. This
is fantastic. I mean, I'm glad we've been able to cross paths in person and stuff as well, at MJ Biz and stuff. And yeah, 2022 is crazy to think about it, but that was the beginning of Clone Coach, and I'm just forever grateful that we were able to cross paths and get an episode out so early in my journey there. And I've just been, giving back to the community in the form of, clone education, ever since then. And it's been a wild ride.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, time has been flying, and it was really good to meet you in person. So today we'll continue on the conversation talking about cloning. I think last time when we talked, it was more beginner friendly, right? We really catered towards the folks that were beginners. This one, I feel like we're going to be dancing into the intermediate side a little bit.
Okay.
So it'll definitely help those folks that maybe are beginners or just getting started with cloning. It'll help them, but it's also going to help the folks that have the experience cloning and gives them some additional tips in order to, either strike roots faster or whatever. So really excited for this one. We also have a bunch of viewer questions lined up. So that last episode, I went and I digged into the comment section, and there were a ton of questions unanswered. So I figured I'd bring those up. Really good questions as well. So I figured I'd grab a handful of those, bring them into this episode, and so we can get some answers for some people there. So a little bit different than what we usually do, but I think it's going to be good.
Yeah, hopefully a lot of those people that watched the first episode were able to implement a lot of those tips and tricks and go from a beginner stage to a more intermediate stage, and then ideally keep growing, in their journey there. It's been a blessing that a lot of people that have joined the Clone Coach team and grabbed my SOPs that, it's been anywhere from, their first time cloning to, they're doing 5,000 clones a week, and these SOPs have been able to help them, throughout, and either, fix problems at the bigger scale, or just get them the early wins that keeps them hooked to grow on their journey and allow them to do more and more and more. So yeah, I'm excited to get into it.
Awesome. Before we get too deep into it, though, I'm sure there's some folks out here that are tuning in that don't know who you are. Can you introduce yourself for those that didn't catch the first episode we did together?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Paul, aka Clone Coach. I think that's the brand that I came up with that summarizes, kind of almost ideally and perfectly, what I do, who I am. I've been in the nursery space commercially for over a decade now. I've been an enthusiast and an advocate, for 2 decades now. So I'm a plant nerd, plant head through and through. And yeah, my specialty is nursery production, clones, efficiency in the nursery, operations, all of that stuff. So I've, used that to create a lot of content online, a lot of free content online via my Instagram and my YouTube channel, to just teach and share all that I know about cloning, and do a lot of Q&A. I've answered, I can't even tell you how many hundreds of questions from the audience and stuff. So yeah, I'm just a dude that loves clones and have found my lane, and it's just all clones all day, every day.
Well, all right. And I know you've been working with a ton of commercial facilities over the years, and I'd really like to know, can you share a success story with us of a commercial facility that you worked with that was maybe struggling and how you helped turn it around?
There's a few stories in the bank. As a blanket, I've helped over 1,000 people, literally all over the world, from Thailand to Germany, all over the states, both big and small. Essentially, make the best clones ever. And on the bigger scale of things, there was a client that I had that was based out of the San Francisco area that were doing about 5,000 clones a week, but they were losing over 1,000, 2,000 clones a week. So their rates were just horrible. And it was essentially due to a pathogen pressure in fusarium. So I was able to do an on-site visit there, diagnose their procedures, their operations, their water temperatures, their irrigation schedules, and implement the SOPs to a T, to where within, the next two batches, we eliminated that giant loss down to double-digit figures versus 4-digit figures. And it's not the first time that it's happened. There was another client of mine that was doing about 5,000 clones a week as well, losing 1,000 clones right off the rip without even having any sort of chance of them coming back at all. And once again, we just dove into the procedures, and their environment was the bigger key there, where they were supplementing a lot of extra humidity in their clone environment, which was bogging down the added humidity that we create when we have the domes on top and the full tray of soaked plugs and all this transpiration happening in this microclimate. The environment itself was way too humid, not allowing any sort of dryback, any sort of hardening off, any sort of roots to search for more moisture and trigger any sort of vegetative growth. So the environmentals are even if the reading may be on point, or your gauge may be within line, if the feeling's not there and if your plants aren't responding properly, you got to kind of ignore that and address the environmentals. So with that environmental change, once again, we eliminated that loss and just brought them back to a 90% plus success rate within 14 days or less. And they're rocking and rolling, which for that scale, that sort of, improvement is just, the value is immense, right? And you don't have to be someone that's doing 5,000 clones a week. I've had a lot of people I had a client in Quebec, Canada recently that I had a coaching call with, and they were just having some mom stock issues, to where their moms were just being overgrown. They weren't getting uniform clones out of their, cutting schedule. So their clones were, they're doing a lot of sorting. They had really good clones and really bad clones. And so we really addressed their mom stock, how to manage the height, how to manage the growth of the mom stock in between cutting sessions if they're not doing regular cuttings, and really dialed back what they were kind of doing in their mom room. It was just too much. It was just 1,000-watt HPS at full blast, 100%. Moms they were cutting every like 3 or 4 weeks. So they had this big lull where the moms just got too unruly. So we just addressed that mom stock, created a new mother stock plan to train them early, keep them short, keep them squat, keep them nice and wide, and create uniform stock that just changed their game as well. And then even on the smaller ends, I get so much feedback from clients that join the Clone Coach team that it's their first go around. It's their first tray of clones. And they're just so stoked because they followed the steps and they're getting roots within 7, 8, 9, 10 days. And they're just like, this is the most beautiful, the most vigorous clone I've ever seen, the widest roots, the fuzziest roots. And they're hooked. They're hooked on this journey now. And they don't see cloning as any sort of burden or any sort of, something they can't get past with these procedures in place. They're just rocking and rolling, which is it's such a blessing to get all this positive feedback and knowing that I'm just able to help, growers all over the world, perform at their best.
Yeah, that's so great to hear. Yeah, I can only imagine like the investment that people have to do in order to be a part of a commercial facility, start up a commercial facility, whatever. And if things go wrong early on in that cloning stage, I mean, it can really have a detrimental effect on the business, on the operation, right? So yeah, that's awesome to hear that you were able to do such a big turnaround there.
Yeah, clones are quite arguably the most important part of cultivation, right? Because any sort of mistake, or even on a positive end, any sort of positive, start, you're going to get that exponential, return throughout the rest of the growing stages. So if you don't have a solid start, you're going to see even more issues down the line. If you have a great start, you're going to have probably one of your best runs down the line. So it's quite arguably the most important step.
100%. So I do have some folks that are in commercial facilities, but I feel like a majority of the folks that are tuning in are home growers. Mm-hmm. And a lot of folks are growing organically. And that was one of the heaviest questions that was left in that last episode. It was really talking about organics. You had mentioned that in the last episode to feed clones the same way you would feed the mother plant. So people heard that and I feel like they just got confused. I feel like the most common way is they're feeding with top dress via amendments and they're wondering, okay, how do I feed the clones? We had people asking, do they use an organic tea, for example, in order to do it? We had other people throwing out some other ways that they were just kind of guessing on how they would use organics to feed clones. If somebody is doing the organic route, and they want to stay organic or all natural when doing the cloning process, what's your suggestion for them?
So on the little comment on teas, I love teas. Any sort of microbial activity that you could introduce to the root zone, I am all about it 100%. When it comes to, matching the mother stock, food, the purpose of that, the theory is you maintain the same growth and color and vigor that you would expect out of that feed from your mom stock. So you don't ever change colors on your clones. You don't ever, have any sort of deficiencies. Now that's with traditional, bottled nutrients or bagged nutrients that you could essentially mix and feed directly to your root zone. With dry amendments and organics, you're creating this, live root zone in your mother stock, right? And you're amending that soil. Those, amendments are slowly unlocking or quickly unlocking and becoming bioavailable for your roots to uptake into your plant stock. Giving you that vigorous growth off of, for your mother stock. Most cloning is done in, plugs, be it cocoa plugs, rockwool plugs, whatever sort of rooting plugs, essentially smaller rooting size medium. Now those are inert, aka there's no nutrient activity, no microbial activity in that media. So it's up to us to add that. Obviously, you can't just top dress amend, some rooting plugs. So people are like, so how do I do it? So it's kind of twofold in agreed. There's a couple ways to think about it. You could I've suggested this to clients where they're like, my mom stock is as healthy as I could ever want it to be. My amendments are on point, all that good stuff. But my clones, what do? I've even suggested taking some of that same soil mix from your mom stock and compressing that into a 50 cell tray or a celled tray and rooting your rooting your clones in that soil mix, same as your mom stock, because that allows the same nutrient uptake that you were expecting, that you already have dialed in. Once they take on roots, they're going to be feeding the exact same thing they were feeding from their mom stock. Now, it's going to be a compressed loose soil, so it won't retain its shape as well before it's fully rooted. Little nuances like that. But if you wait till it's fully rooted, you're going to pull out that clone and it's going to be vibrant, and it's going to be enough to transplant, no problem. Microbial teas, compost teas, anything like that, worm casting teas, those are all super beneficial. I would highly recommend to soak that regardless if you're using bottled nutrients or, this soil mix from your mom's stock, to feed that to soak that into your rooting media as well. You're going to get nothing but benefits from it, unlocking nitrogen, protecting against pathogens, an abundance of beneficial activity happening there for you. If you were just using rooting media, standard rooting media, and you didn't take a soil sample to root into, at the bare minimum, once again, using a compost tea is going to create some sort of activity. What you may suffer, you'll get them to root, because rooting and nutrient uptake and color is kind of two different separate areas. So you could get the clone to root with the proper procedures, the proper environment, enough humidity to retain it, slowly reduce humidity to encourage root growth. What you may suffer is the discoloration or the nutrient deficiency in your growth, in your clone, material up top. So if at the bare minimum, all you could do is you do a microbial drench, you'll get them to root, but you may have to transplant quickly and have a little delay in that nutrient uptake again if you aren't using that same sample. So there's a couple different ways to look at it, and depends on your kind of grace as far as what you expect out of your clones. If you have no room for any sort of error, any sort of, bounce back or anything like that, then I'd probably get the soil sample. If you're doing, 50, 100 more clones, probably going to go to the plugs, probably going to do the compost tea, and you probably can't dry amendment or use a soil sample, so you could get them to root quickly, or as soon as you get them root, transplant them and just give them a week or so to start uptaking, the nutrients from your soil mix that you got there. So a couple ways to think about it, but it's possible with what you're working with.
Are any of the rooting hormone products on the market today considered organic?
No. Simple answer is no. IBA, which is indole 3-butyric acid, there is a IAA, if I'm not mistaken, is a naturally occurring hormone within the plant. So this is close as an organic, naturally occurring hormone chemically possible, but since it's man-made, it's that one change in the chemistry there. But IBA is the closest thing to what's naturally occurring in your plant. Some other things like honey, aloe, things like that may have some characteristics that will aid in rooting kind of in a secondary fashion. Say, honey may have some antimicrobial properties that'll help prevent against any sort of pathogens, which in turn will allow the plant to root without being overtaken by pathogens and just losing or not rooting due to the pathogen pressure or anything like that. So it may be kind of secondary actions, but they're not rooting hormones, right? So it's kind of a little bit of chemistry and some naturally occurring products can aid, but they can't be like listed as like rooting hormones, but they could aid in just like reducing stressors, protecting against pathogens. And if the procedures are right and your stock is super vibrant and healthy, that could be enough to get you through the rooting process.
I'm glad you brought up honey and aloe. Actually, the honey was one of the questions that viewers have left in the past. Does honey actually work? Another thing that somebody had left was, what are your thoughts on cinnamon as a rooting compound?
I almost said cinnamon too. Once again, those are like natural ingredients that are great for organic gardening and do have beneficial properties. That, if you use cinnamon, say for, pest control, for, antimicrobial properties, things like that, you're going to get some natural benefits, right? Now, if you did like a side-by-side and say which rooted better, I'd probably put my money on the rooting hormone because that's its sole purpose. That's the only thing it's going to do for that plant. So, you could go super natural, super organic, but you probably won't be on a commercial scale or say, hey, I'm hitting my dates every time, very predictable. as most people know, if they're growing in living soil or using amendments, it's not sharp turns like a speedboat, right? Where quick adjustments and quick results. It's more of a cruise ship. It's, slow and steady. They break down. You're not going for speed, right? You're just going for health and organic inputs.
Understood. Now, I've been doing aeroponic cloning recently, the past like 6 months or so, really kind of getting heavy into it and kind of playing around, doing my own little experiments and stuff. And, geez, there's a lot of questions that people have in regards to aeroponic cloning, myself included. So I'd like to get your feedback on this a little bit. First thing I want to start off with nutrient solution in the water. I think this is the biggest thing that people are concerned about is what do you put in the water? There's Clonex, which is probably one of the most popular things that people put into the water is a dose of Clonex.
Mm-hmm.
Some people just put CalMag in there only. I've experimented with that. Some people go so far as to do like a half dose or a quarter dose of nutrient solution according to the feeding chart. Usually it's for like the seedling stage.
Mm-hmm.
What's your general recommendation for the nutrient solution that should be in the water when you're aeroponic cloning?
When it comes to nutrient solution, you don't want to go too light because it may not cause any issues early on, but once you strike roots, you're going to slow down the plant's growth characteristics if there's not the proper nutrient levels once there's roots. So that kind of goes back to my initial theory of trying to match what you're feeding your mom stock. So if you're feeding your mom stock, call it 2.0 EC worth of nutrients, right? On a base nutrient mix, whatever brand you choose to use. And if you do your clones in something that's a quarter strength of that, 0.5 EC, and that's all those clones are getting fed, even once they strike roots, you're more than likely going to suffer some deficiencies in your clone stock. So I would use a vegetative base mix, right? Similar to your mom stock. If you want to go low, I wouldn't go less than half strength. I wouldn't go less than that because you're going to start to see some deficiencies more than likely. But conservatively, call it half strength, 1.0 EC worth of vegetative nutrient mix in that solution. You're going to be rocking and rolling. You also don't want to go too light, like I said, where you're just using, say, RO water and nothing else. Or RO water and a little bit of CalMag. That's just doing really the bare minimum. And, you could just get more out of your plants once they strike roots by having a little bit more food in there ready for them to uptake. And since the light would be lower, they won't need as much. But to have enough there to have some substance once they start triggering that root growth and that nutrient uptake just helps avoid a 3 to 6 day deficiency period that you're going to need to bounce back from. And especially with aeroponic cloning, that is probably the fastest rooting process possible. So, if you have food in there earlier and they strike roots faster, you're just going to, create a much quicker process and have that plant ready for transplant much sooner and avoid any sort of bounce back. So with what to mix in there, I would at least go half strength vegetative mix at the bare minimum. There's some people, can go to, full strength, but, I think it might be a little on the excess side, especially with this style. But, I like that you brought up aeroponics. I think it's at that happy medium between what we just discussed as far as like cloning with dry amendments or like a soil mix. This is kind of happy medium where you take that same stem off of a living soil mom, right? Just have a little bit of nutrient mix and you could plug that right back into, that living soil mix as well. So I like that it's a happy medium there.
Yeah, I'm having a lot of fun with it and playing around. Like I did start out with just RO water in there to begin, my first set of clones. And it seemed to take a little bit longer to root. Generally you hear, hey, strike roots in 5 days, 6 days. Well, with just water, it took me 7-8 days to do it. Now, when I had just CalMag in there, it seemed to have sped that up 5-6 days. You can start to see roots coming out of there. Haven't really done the low dose of nutrients yet. I'm going to have to try that next.
Yeah, because, base nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, they do aid in root growth, right? So having nutrients there is going to aid in the root growth and root development. So root elongation, all these factors of growth. So removing said nutrients, like your experience showed, can slow down the process, can create little smaller, weaker roots, perhaps. Like, won't be as vibrant and abundant if there's just a little bit of a diverse base of micro and macro nutrients in that mix.
All right. And then another thing that I found to be pretty important is the water temperature. Now, I live in the desert, and I found that my water temperature, especially with the pump running and stuff, it gets very high 70s. It's touched low 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm doing the frozen water bottle technique where I put in a frozen water bottle, swapping it out morning and evening in order to try to get that lower temperature. What's your general recommendation for water temperature when doing aeroponic cloning?
Water temperature is critical, super critical. Just like in any sort of growing, method, if your water temperature is too high, you're going to encourage a lack of oxygen levels in your water, and you're going to encourage an increase in pathogen pressure in that media. That's the one big factor when it comes to aeroponic cloning, is the water temperature staying as cool in like normal, right? High 60s, low 70s. You don't really want to get past mid 70s, creeping into the high 70s, low 80s. You're just going into an area that just decreases oxygen, dissolve oxygen levels in your water, and increases the possibility for pathogen to take over. And it's not going to be conducive for a vibrant, healthy root zone as well. So, depends on your size of aeroponic cloner. If you're on the smaller scale, that water bottle trick, may be perfect for that. If you get up to like the, 144 site or something, and it's what you're relying on, and you're in a desert like yourself and myself, you're probably going to want to invest in a little water chiller, which will keep you at the right temperature. But with aeroponic cloning, as you scale up, your infrastructure starts to scale up as well. Like a water chiller, more frequent water change outs, dealing with that that volume of water on the bigger systems and stuff. So your infrastructure starts to increase and your equipment starts to increase as you scale up aeroponics. But on the small scale, I think that frozen water bottle should be enough. And I know it might be on one of our questions here, which is the pump running, which is that clearly, obviously aids into the heat in that water. So not running your pump nonstop is going to be another big factor.
Sorry, can you clarify a little bit, not running the pump nonstop? So do you recommend that folks have it kind of on a timer to where they're, maybe spraying every 15 minutes and then it stops at 15 minutes, or what was your recommendation for how often it should spray?
100%. If you run your pump nonstop, you're going to run into the, excessively warm water and probably, slower rooting process than what's possible. Usually either I like to kind of do a 5, 10, or 15, right? Depending on people's environment, what size setup, what room they're in, all that good stuff, how much, they're dealing with water temperature fluctuations. But at the bare minimum, 5 on, 5 off. If you get up to a 10 on, 10 off, or 15 on, 15 off, that allows for the water temperature to not, get too high on you because of that motor running, that pump running. You still have enough humidity in that, inside the unit to, be conducive for root growth. And you have this oxygen that's still in that air to be, conducive for root growth as well. So I would definitely at least start at the bare minimum, 5 on, 5 off. So you go to 10, 10, so if you go to 15, 15, and that should help you manage the water temperature increasing while getting better results. Because if you leave the pump on nonstop, there's never this break for, oxygen to kind of play its role in that, nice humid environment as well. And then your water temperatures are going to be spiking up on you. Then you're just kind of, working a little bit harder than necessary.
Got it. Yeah, I've just been letting it run 24/7, so I'm gonna definitely try it out and do probably 5 on, 5 off, or 10
Yeah,
on, 10 off, something like that in
just
the future.
start somewhere like that, and I think you'll get some better results.
Okay, cool. Light cycle is what I want to get into next. And now this really isn't just for aeroponic cloning, right? I guess it's really all cloning. Some people do 18/6 light cycle, some people do 20/0, some people do 24 hours of just straight light for clones. What's your recommendation for light cycle?
Simple answer: 24 hours. Because the growth rate and that kind of microclimate that we're creating here, we need light to trigger photosynthesis, to encourage root growth. So if you take away light during this period when there is a lack of roots and we're just really focusing on just trying to create a root zone, we are slowing down our process here, because without the light there is no photosynthesis. Without the photosynthesis, we're not making the plant trigger, the need to create a root zone to start, uptaking nutrients. So I think there's a solid benefit to just staying at 24 hours. Because if you were in domes and stuff and you do, 18/6, 6 hours off, then you kind of create this little spike in extra humidity as well. And you're slowing down the roots, and that combination could start leading you into some problems, either pathogen pressures, spiking up some mold possibly, or at the bare minimum, slowing your rooting process down. So 24 hours, for the 7 to 14 day period works, really, really well.
Oh, that makes sense. And then as far as the amount of light, clones don't need much light. I've heard between 100 and 200 ppfd is fine. Some people say 200 ppfd is too much. What do you generally advise for amount of light?
The 100 or 150 is where I usually play. Once there's, for sure for the first week, right? For the first week, you do not want more than 200 ppfd. It's going to be too much light, creating too much, photosynthesis in the plant that does not have any root zone. So it's going to be an imbalance there. But low enough light to trigger those things that happen internally is great. And that second week, or as you start to strike some roots and start to harden off your clones, get to that second week of the rooting process, you can increase your light to up to that 200 ppfd. But once there's a root zone there to kind of help support that increase in light. But when there's no root zone yet, less is better.
Got it. Pretty straightforward there. Now, how about the temperature and relative humidity in the environment? This is another thing that people get caught up on. What is the ideal temperature? What is the ideal relative humidity?
Yeah, I mean, you don't want it to be cold and damp. Okay. You don't want your humidifier pumping and your AC set at 74 degrees and it's just cold and damp. You're like, well, it's, excess humidity for the rooting process. Sure. But your lack of temperature is not encouraging environment to trigger root growth. Think of a prop house. Prop houses are warm and humid, right? So you definitely want some warmth in there. 78 to 80 degrees is a beautiful little sweet spot for propagation. You can fluctuate 1 or 2 degrees, but when you really go down below 78 degrees, when you have the excess humidity as well, it just starts to close this gap and starts to hinder growth. I mean, think about it. Even if it was a fully rooted plant, if you lowered the temperatures down, you're going to slow the growth down as well. If you increase the temperatures, they're going to be drinking a lot more water and they're going to be growing a lot faster. So 78 to 80, I think, is a beautiful sweet spot that most people could manage to meet. When it comes to humidity, once again, too much can be detrimental. Not enough, you're going to see instant wilt because there's no root zone and things like that. So 65 to 69% humidity, relative humidity in the room, works wonders for me. If you're doing aeroponics and you don't have a dome on top of them, you're probably going to want to be on the top end of that, because depending on your room setup, how much airflow, how much space, if you're too dry and you don't have a root zone yet and you don't have a dome on your aeroponic setup, that could cause early wilt due to a lack of moisture that could sustain, those clones to stay turgid and stay upright and stay rigid. So 78, 65. If you use the VPD scale, I like to be usually ends about a 1.0 on the VPD scale. So I like to maintain that regardless, but just know if you go too low and you're still 1.0, but there's no root zone and you're trying to root, it's not going to be conducive for root growth. But if it's a fully vegetative plant, you can still get vegetative growth out of it. But if you're too high, say you're 84 degrees and 70% humidity or 72% humidity, that excess humidity is just going to kind of suffocate a little bit too much and not be conducive for that root zone to kind of have enough, but not too much, right? Just want to be at that nice little sweet spot.
Understood. I'm glad you brought up the no dome for aeroponic cloning. That's something I did want to talk to you about. When I first got my aeroponic cloning machine, it had instructions on it. And one of the things I believe it said, I think it was in capital letters, bold, a lot of exclamation points. It said, do not use a dome with this. And I was like, what?
Okay.
What the heck is it talking about? Yeah, cloning, you always want to use a dome for cloning, right? And so I did my due diligence. I searched a couple different areas and trying to find people who were using dome versus not using the dome. And yeah, it seems like a lot of people, they're getting better results by not using a dome when aeroponic cloning. It can make things actually worse. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's designed to work that way, but I think, the asterisk is that your environment can't be an extreme of one or the other, right? It has to kind of be in that sweet spot. But yeah, like with my experience previously, like I know there was like too much airflow hitting it. So I, wanted to kind of create this buffer, and, they don't really sell domes for aeroponic cloners. And that might be the reason why they're not readily available, right? It's not like a standard issue kind of, addition to the product. But yeah, I guess in that case, if it's not designed for it, listen to the instructions, right? But just know that if you're in a super dry climate, it's super hot, and if you do see some wilt early on, then that's probably going to be the reason why. But if your spray, cycle is on point, and you're not seeing any sort of visual issues with wilting or anything like that early on, yeah, that's that visual check of being a gardener and saying, okay, I'll take the advice, I'll read the instructions, maybe yes, maybe no, but at the end of the day, you got to read what your plants are saying. So if your plants are still happy and still rigid and still staying upright, you don't need the dome, because that's what the dome is for, is to create this microclimate to add extra humidity to aid in, the plants staying upright. But if they're staying upright already, then, you don't need to suffocate them either.
Yeah, I think the general consensus was that having a dome on there, since there's water underneath, it was too humid. If you have a dome, it's too humid and it's hard to control. So I think that was the main reason why people said to avoid using a dome when using aeroponic cloning. So I think I just mentioned that one too.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it could have its place, but, I wouldn't keep those vents closed or anything like that either, right? I would still monitor to see how soon we can remove this dome, ideally anyways. So, it's not something would be meant to be held on for the entire process either. It would just be to buffer you if you are, suffering some wilt early on. Just get them past that stage and then eventually remove it as soon as possible.
Got it. Now we had another viewer question. One of the things they ask is, do you recommend to trim the leaf tips? That's a common practice that a lot of people do when they're cloning. They'll just cut off the tips of the leaves and then they'll put it into the medium or the aeroponic cloner or whatever. Do you recommend that? This particular person had mentioned that they watched your latest video and you seem to trim just the larger leaves.
Definitely. I mean, you can trim too much, and that's detrimental to the new development growth on the plant. It kind of looked like a Bart Simpson kind of head, where they just pulled the clone down and chopped it, but it was too low, so all of that new growth as well was cut in half. Essentially, that middle growth needs to be untouched, right? Then moving down the plant, you have your fan leaves on your next node developments, right? So you have a little node, area, and then your fan leaf attached to that. If they're fully developed fan leaves, yeah, we're going to want to reduce those in half, especially if we're, cloning enough to kind of create this canopy. Because in a canopy, if you leave that full size fan leaf, you're probably going to cover the clone on that's next to it. And that new growth on the clone, if it's covered and trapped in a little humid environment, it's going to rot. It's going to rot really easy. It's super susceptible to rot because the new development is just so fragile. And so, that'll be one of the reasons why to cut in half and to slow down the transpiration rate. Because we don't have a fully rooted plant yet, we want to slow down the transpiration a bit just to get us through that rooting process, and then we'll won't be worried about the fan leaf size on that plant. So I recommend it. I've trialed every which way to kind of trim up a clone before rooting, leaving it bare, leaving the full fan leaves, all that good stuff. If there's space next to your, the next one over, you can leave the full size fan leaf. I would still just kind of at least remove one entire one and just leave one behind untouched at the kind of max there. But the kind of standard way to just grab the stem, pull it through your hand, and have the material across the top that we just trim off the top, and you end up with everything kind of cut nicely in half. Just works as a pretty standard method there.
Okay, got it. So like I mentioned in the beginning of the episode, we have lots of people who are brand new to this, right? Some people might just be looking to clone right now after listening to this episode. What's your biggest advice for someone who's brand new to cloning? They're doing it for the first time.
To watch all of the Mr. Grow It episodes and content available for free and absorb as much as possible before you go and attack. Honestly, like you could, if you're not sure about this and you're starting out, that's the beauty about where we're at today, is that there's so much available content for free for you to learn from before you even take your first snip. And for that'd be honestly my first recommendation. Just learn as much as you can from what's out there. But let's say you're ready to clone, you're ready to go. Sometimes more is better. So say let's an example, you're using a dome and a tray and rooting plugs, right? In my opinion, it's much harder to root 2, 3, 4, 5 snips in that entire dome setup than it is to root 25, 35, 40, 50 snips in that entire rooting setup. Because you kind of create, with more plant material, you create a more uniform environment, more uniform dry back. You kind of have the plants next to it kind of assist in a little bit of humidity as well. But if it's just 2 or 3 little snips in this kind of empty space, it could be a little bit harder to keep those turgid and rigid and get them to the rooting process, because they don't kind of have that support system around them. So if you're taking clones and you have a mother plant, and you're starting off, I would just suggest take a few more cuts. Try to fill up what you can on that one tray. Or conversely, if you're doing less stock, find a little simple, hobby level tray that holds 6, cuttings or something like that. Basically, you don't want this big difference in space between your plant material and your rooting setup. So with that, I would just say cut more, get more practice in there. The first time I ever cloned a plant ever in my life, I took 35, 40 clones. And, just to fill up the tray, the practice, the trimming, the snipping, the depth, sticking to depth as well, playing with it on, just kind of getting this rhythm going. So I would just suggest maybe fill up ensure you don't have a big gap between your setup and your plant material. That's going to be a really big, helpful, tip or trick. And just obviously, plug in all the parameters we've been discussing, and, absorb all the free content out there. And I think you're going to be okay.
Good advice. Yeah, the point about taking extra clones, I think, is a really good one, because a good example now, I took 6 clones, put them in my aeroponic cloner, and 4 of them struck roots. 2 of them, I don't know why they wouldn't strike roots. The only thing I could think of is maybe the sprayers aren't positioned correctly. It's kind of they're on the same side of the aeroponic cloner. I don't know what happened there, but I'm glad I took more than just one or two cuts because I took more than what was needed, and luckily, I got 4 out of the 6 to root. So yeah, taking extra cuts is can definitely be helpful.
100%, 100%. And if it's your first time, you don't know what's going to take. You're still learning your mom's stock. Maybe she had a little stress. Maybe she did it. Maybe a little corner of the setup or the corner of the room got a little bit more air than the others. So many little nuanced factors like that. But yeah, take more than necessary. You could always, whittle down, pick the best, and guarantee you have what you need to move forward, versus just taking the bare minimum, suffering some loss for whatever reason, and then not having enough. So, take more, take as many as you can.
Absolutely. So if someone were to want to reach out to you, where can they find you?
Clone Coach everywhere. CloneCoach.com. Clone Coach on Instagram, Clone Coach on YouTube. Luckily enough, when I started this Clone Coach journey, Clone Coach was available everywhere. So just Google Clone Coach or just YouTube it, Instagram it, go to CloneCoach.com. Look up my previous episode here with you. Plug it in. There's some podcasts out there. There's a lot of stuff. So just plug in Clone Coach wherever you're searching.
Easy enough. And is there anything you have upcoming in the future that you want to talk about?
I'm in Southern California, going to be hosting some more events. So, putting that in the calendar once we kind of get past summer here in the hot desert. So events for some commercial operators out here in Southern California. Just going and trying to create more content and more series on the Clone Coach end of things. So just watch out for more content there. Be doing some more lives. I do a lot of Q&As on my Instagram and stuff too. So if you have questions, you could, hop onto there. I got a whole library on YouTube of a bunch of clone question episodes I've done. But I'm just trying to, stay on the path of creating content for Clone Coach and, getting people to make the best clones ever all over the world, using my SOPs and, just trying to stay in this lane and should keep helping people.
Awesome. I'll definitely link to Paul's social media down in the YouTube description section below so you can easily access it. I also put a link to the previous episode we did down there so you can tune into that one if you haven't seen it already. What questions do you have in regards to cloning? Let us know in the comment section below. Also, if you do the cloning process and you've got some tips that maybe weren't mentioned here, drop that in the comment section as well. Want to give a shout out to the folks that are supporting on Patreon, patreon.com/MrGrowit. 100% of what is donated through Patreon goes right back into the podcast. You help keep this podcast going, so thank you so much for your support. The folks that are being scrolled on the screen right now are in the producer tier. Special thanks to you. Paul, thanks so much for coming on to the podcast, man. This was awesome to swing around one more time and get some more information out of you, dude. Really appreciate your time today and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if anybody's, ready to make that, journey to grab the SOPs on clonecoach.com, you could use Mr. Grow It as a discount code as well to save you a little percentage there as well. But man, Chris, this has been fantastic. I'm glad that, years later, we're still on our journeys and still doing the things, still helping people all over the world and doing our best to create good content. So thank you for having me back. I really appreciate it.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Thanks so much, everyone. Catch you in the next episode. Peace.